Hello. Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this evening. This evening's lecture will be followed by a performance and demo of biosonification of plant data. And you will know more about what that means after Skooby's talk. But it is very exciting to announce Skooby Laposky as our visiting artist today. He is our first in a series of the 4D design program. So for any of you who have not heard about the 4D design program yet, we are a brand new program at the Academy, the first new program in 47 years, and our focus is on exploring creative applications of emerging technology. If anyone is interested in hearing more, I am more than thrilled to talk more about it. But for the moment, what I'd love to do is introduce our speaker. Skooby Laposky is an alum of the Cranbrook Academy of Art. He and I were actually classmates together at the turn of the millennium. And it was a really fertile period of time for incorporating the computer into our work. And Skooby was in the print media program, Printmaking. It was called Printmaking at the time. And what's interesting is that I had to rack my brain to remember that, because in a very Cranbrook way and in a very 4D way, Skooby, was he sculpture or was he, I couldn't remember. Because Skooby has worked across all media and in particular has incorporated sound in his work. And I think at the time that we were here, that interest in sound really influenced the work that all of us were doing. I know that it influenced my work. And he's gone on to continue to be an artist in various media and a very successful DJ, composer. He's hypnotized crowds all over the world in various discotheques in Europe. He also wrote the score for the New York Times produced movie Bill Cunningham, New York, which is a great film all around, but the score is fabulous. And he also has a record label that goes under the name Wilde Calm and has accomplished many other endeavors in sound media, playing with robots, and I'm going to let him tell you the rest. So without further ado, here's Skooby Laposky.
Thank you, Carla, and thanks for coming tonight. Let's see here. So, in my family history, there's definitely a lineage of people using technology beyond their original intention. This next slide is my great uncle Ben F. Laposky, who's credited with creating some of the first electronic art, the first visual electronic art. The previous guy, he's just testing out some equipment with his oscilloscope. This is Uncle Ben working on one of his pieces. So he built essentially a custom analog visual synthesizer in the late 40s, early 50s. And this is one of the pieces. It's one of his salons. These pieces traveled all over the world. So I kind of knew growing up, wanting to be an artist, that there was a history in the family, like someone using technology for creative means. And actually, originally, it was Uncle Ben's intention to use this for his commercial work, because he was a draftsman and a commercial sign painter, and he was trying to figure out a way to expand his visual vocabulary. And so then these things kind of took a life on their own. So coming to Cranbrook, I was studied undergrad in printmaking with a focus on drawing and traditional printmaking, like etching and lithography. And I liked those traditional techniques to take an image and repeat it and transform it that way. So coming in as a grad student, I kind of had, there's sort of two cultural figures that resonated with me as a young man, and they still kind of pertain to what I do now. It was the computer hacker and then the DJ, and how they're taking information and using it for their own means, and creating an individual voice that way. So when I got here, I was still kind of working on traditional work, drawing, doing a little bit of printing, and I happened upon a robotic arm that I found at a Goodwill in downtown Detroit, and I thought, like, okay, this is my time to explore. I'm at Cranbrook, like, what can I do with this thing? So I'm like, let's play around with some mark making devices. So I got some Sharpies and some charcoal, and I started trying to draw with it to see, like, okay, maybe I can get some interesting marks with this. So that started the idea, and then I was, at the same time, I was like getting into the John Cage's work and his ideas, and I always liked the quote he was talking about imitating nature and like trying to dial back your ego. So I thought a good way would be to use these like basic robotic systems to do that, to help facilitate that. At the time, I think I was ordering these different robotic kits from Robot World. And this is one called Hyper Peppy that responded to sound. So any like transient sound, it would change direction. So I had this thing, I made like a holder for a Sharpie in the back, and I had it set up actually in the student lounge here, and it would draw like on backdrop paper, probably 12 feet tall by 20 feet long, and I had it set up so it would just draw all day based on the sounds that were coming from a television that was just set up on like NBC. So the shows throughout that day were sort of like a score for like what had created the drawing. And I like this idea, like Rube Goldberg's inventions, like taking something like a really complex system to have like a really simple output. I thought, is it possible to do the opposite, to create something larger than what you're inputting? So I was trying to play with these kind of input-output systems. So I had another robot, which the Navius, where you can see like a paper disc on the left, in that left dome, where it would read black and white patterns, and it would trigger kind of in a binary way, like off-on, to trigger the left and right motors. So I took that kind of sort of that grid, and I actually made it more, gave it more resolution, so I could put words on it and kind of alphanumeric data. So I was doing portraits of the students based on their social security numbers. So each student, I would use a Japanese ink brush connected to the back, and they would get like a single brush stroke of based off of their social security number, which is a pretty like banal set of data to have. Yeah, I had a series of robots, and actually some of the robots that were kind of smarter actually gave me like the results weren't as good, because there was almost too much of themselves in it, or actually the functions were probably almost like too complex to create like some of the work that I was trying to do. At the same time, I started getting interested in creating music, like sample-based music, because at the time I had no formal musical training, so I was like into electronic music, into hip-hop, and so I started sampling records, and that's actually kind of how I found out about John Cage's music, because I was looking for interesting sounds. And at the time, no one had laptops, so you had to have like a dedicated piece of hardware for kind of a very specific thing. So I was like sampling audio and figuring out ways to manipulate it. And then I started working with the Macalas, who ran the 2D program at the time, and they were doing a lot of interesting work around the world and on campus. So one of the first big projects they hired me to work on was over at the Institute of Science for the Connections Theater. I don't know if you guys have seen it. I was over there yesterday, and they actually just changed it over in the last year to a VR experience, which makes sense because at that time, I think you can see one of the projectors in the upper right corner. So there are multiple projections on scrims, and so I was working on all of the sound design for that, and kind of cut my teeth like editing audio and like a early version of Pro Tools, and that project was challenging, just technically learning the software, but to think about everything with some longevity, knowing that it was semi-permanent, and I think it almost was up for 20 years, which is kind of crazy to think about. So as I was doing the visual work, I was working, started working on sound projects while I was a student. And so after graduating from Cranbrook, I went to Europe for a bit, and then ended up in New York and started a sound design studio, and still working, still having like connections with Cranbrook colleagues. And so this was a project by a ceramics student and someone in 2D, Arjen Noordeman and Christy Wright. So they created these musical instruments that were made out of clay. So they had a whole collection, and they sampled all of the instruments and tasked me with creating kind of the theme music for like their promotional video. And they actually released an album on vinyl of it was actually an indie hip hop album, and all the samples were from these instruments. And they had probably the Museum of Art and Design's first and only hip hop show in their auditorium. So this is just like a sample of what I came up with. So a lot of the instruments only played like one note, so I had to go and like multi-sample and try to map some of the notes to have more variety with the piece I created. So last year there was actually at the Museum of Art and Design, they had an exhibition, Sonic Arcade, and all the AudioWare pieces were shown in their entirety, and they had all the various, like I think the album, there was a listening station for the album, and then the video, the promotional video that I worked on. So that connection, I kind of developed those friendships and relationships with Christy and Arjen while we were students, and then we kind of just continued that relationship after graduating. That was like a really great project to work on. So another project I worked on, probably the first one with Carla, she called me and said, I have this robot project, because she knew about my robot work here. And the first briefing when you were at Smart Design, right, was they mentioned Wallace and Gromit were like it was like I guess the relationship that you wanted to have, like the consumer with like the device, with the robot. So it was kind of fun. I watched like I kind of got reacquainted with Wallace and Gromit as part of my research. So this was the Nito XV11 that we worked on. It was kind of that's actually, Nito is still making robots, and I think they're probably on like their 10th or 11th, 12th like version. We actually have one at our place, and I hadn't heard those sounds for years, and they're the same sounds. So I'll just go through the ones we came up with. Like the challenge at the time was like the chip that held the sound, because they had to be samples, was very short. And in order to have a full sound set, really had to limit like the type of like melodic phrase that we could use. So it was like thinking of, okay, what's like a good like audio logo, like wake up sound with using 5 notes. So I was trying to play with the intervals of the notes and then the cadence. So I'll just go through these here. So a year later, I was contacted by Nito, and they brought me out to Mountain View to work on a new sound set. Because at the time, it was kind of like it was cool to have like you could customize your sound sets for your ring, essentially like a ringtone. And so they wanted to have it for the XV11. So they had these concepts that take the original sound set, and they couldn't call it R2D2, so they called it Sassy Droid. Sorry. So there's a full set, but I won't play all those for you. And this was like based on Rosie, the maid from the Jetsons. So that was actually my favorite. Kind of had like kind of retro-futuristic, kind of had like a mechanical sound, but still kind of electronic. I think I use a lot of marimba for this. So yeah, so with WAAVES, I was doing sound design work in, with like various challenges, like technical challenges, and just learning like how to be a sound designer. So yeah, like Carla mentioned, so I worked, like a lot of my projects, they're traditional work. And the director from this film, he contacted me because he'd actually heard some of my remix work online, just like the stuff that was more club oriented, and thought it would be interesting to take classic New York songs and try to make them more contemporary, like remixing like Frank Sinatra. But when I saw the rough cut of the film, I knew that it was like the wrong direction to go for who like Bill Cunningham was. But doing even the traditional work, like these experiments I'm working on with the plant biodata, it's like just trying to still expand my vocabulary. Like maybe there's some new things I can hear when I'm working with these new devices that'll inform even the more traditional work. So after I started WAAVES, I wanted to create a small like boutique label to release initially my own music, and then I started releasing other friends' music that I was working with at the time when I was in New York. So this is some of the records. Like actually some Cranbrook alum have helped design these, and I always take a very long time with the visuals because I know that like my Cranbrook people are gonna see it and wonder like what happened if the cover's not good or the wrong typeface. So I'll just play a couple. So this is an album of mine where I used prepared piano to create. I guess a lot of my work was like kind of a marriage of things. So I was like trying to use prepared piano and still like maybe make a record that you could play out in the club. So this record is under my Boonlorn moniker. So trying to introduce more like acoustic kind of atonal sounds in a club music kind of context. This is one from a composer, the late Elodie Lawton. I started working with a lot of the artists and musicians that were kind of fixtures in the New York scene in like the 70s and 80s. They all worked with the late Arthur Russell as well, so I was releasing their music and collaborating on their projects. Let's see if I can get this. So this is one of Elodie's modular synth pieces. So I think around 2014, I was like searching around Kickstarter to see like what new projects people were trying to get off the ground. And I saw one by this collective called Data Garden, based out of Philly, and they had this device called the MIDI Sprout, and it reads microconductivity in plants, like in their leaves, and it changes that into MIDI. And I've been using MIDI a lot in my work, and so I was thinking like it would be a great way to have like some sort of generative system that had like a biological component. So it got funded, and I actually started like building them myself once I worked with I was in touch with the engineer who worked on the project. So I guess that's. Data Garden, they're a collective of like artists and musicians, and they partnered with Sam Cusimano, who's an electrical engineer, and I feel like that's like a great pairing to have this like idea, and then have someone with the technical know-how to help realize it. So their influence, I'm sure many of you know the book and the documentary, The Secret Life of Plants. A lot of the people that use the MIDI Sprout, I think, are along this spectrum, like that are really interested in like plant consciousness. And for me, it's an interest, but I actually like the fact that it's a set of data, and I'm always curious of like, okay, how I'm using the data. Can data be a medium, and like are those choices I'm making like filtering the data, or like preparing the data, almost like a prepared piano string, if that's possible, like where my voice is in limiting that data or redirecting it. So this is an image from some of the experiments in the 70s. They're like trying to visualize the biofeedback. And this is another image of Cage. He had a piece that actually debuted in the mid-'70s in Detroit called Child of Tree. And I just like the idea of using this like organic material to create a composition where the form is actually kind of outside of yourself, like just naturally occurring. So I started investigating the MIDI Sprout and doing some performances. This one's at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston. I think it's my first performance there. So they have like, you can see they have like a really beautiful courtyard, and I like the idea of like a very site-specific piece. And I worked with a horticulturalist to see which plants I could work with. And then, throughout I would change the different plants to change the performance. And another thing about like this sort of data stream that the MIDI Sprout gives me, it's perfect for music, because like the fluctuations in the data work really well with like a contour in music to keep it interesting and to have that contour. So I've done performances in spaces like that, and then I've taken the MIDI Sprout out into the wild. I don't know if you can see that sort of black form there is me in the mountains in Iceland, kind of in the middle of nowhere, trying to get some readings from some Icelandic moss. So anywhere I travel, I try to take some type of MIDI Sprout kit with me, however limited, to do these recordings. Is sort of like a travel log of where I've been and what the plants are, and like what kind of data they're giving me with the music, the composition. So this is another one, like another part of Iceland I was like recording as well. I'm trying to create like a travel log of like the places I've been in, like the readings and the recordings that I've been able to produce. So so Carla and I are working on a project right now that's going to be happening in the springtime on the campus with MIDI Sprouts and some other types of sensors. And we're trying to figure out like new ways to play with that MIDI data to kind of maybe interrupt or redirect that sort of data stream. So we're combining our expertise for like a few like localized experiences around the campus. Let's see. I think that's the majority of it. Does anyone have any questions? Any questions? Okay, sure. I know there's a lot of coverage for the things I've worked on. I mean, I guess there's a sort of a business side of it that like with vinyl you can you can control like the distribution of it. Like you actually have a physical thing that's the music that I can send out, and it's well, some of the records I didn't show all of them, but some of the work I do, if it exists on vinyl, there's a kind of a gray area if it's like an unofficial like rework of another artist. Like I did a record where I took some Steve Reich music and reworked it, but I didn't contact Steve about it. But if it was on vinyl, there's like a limited number of those, so it can be I guess can be accounted for. But I mean, I like the format of vinyl. Like just I guess from a design perspective is too, like 12 by 12 jacket is great. I know it's interesting to be sort of like, I wouldn't call myself really like a nostalgist, but I like the like classic format, but then working with like new ideas, like new technology, new devices. I hope that answered something.
And also, can you talk about the book?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm currently writing this book about my great uncle Ben. Just like visual or video synthesis, audio synthesis, like modular synthesizers are very popular, and he was able to create this system himself with just kind of standard components. And he did all this work in my hometown in Iowa, which is like a small farm community in northwestern Iowa in the 50s. And like actually, it's fascinating because I found correspondence of his with like people like Georgi Keeps at MIT before he started the Media Lab. And so like my Uncle Ben knew he knew who to contact and what they were doing, so he had an awareness. It's like way pre-internet, and actually I guess that leads to like I was thinking too, like when I was here at Cranbrook, it was way before like open source communities, so it's kind of like trying to find out like how to do things technically, or just even have a community of like-minded people. It was like sort of I know it's exciting time now for me to continue to work because there's that exists, and there's a lot of ideas are shared online, and code is shared. So yeah, I find it like very a good time to be alive, to do work. Yes. Okay.
So are you pulling a single data stream off of the microcurrents? And if so, are you feeding that, like, is that driving pitch data, or is that driving knobs on, VST for synthesis? What exactly are you driving?
So it's giving me MIDI notes. Pitch. But then I can take that and reassign that however I see fit. Like if I have it connected to my modular, I can take that MIDI and convert that into control voltage, and then that can go however I want to control an amplifier or another oscillator. And then I have it going into a laptop running Ableton Live software, so that controls like virtual instruments. So it kind of like, I was talking to Carl today that like MIDI is sort of like a very basic like data set that you can manipulate it a lot. It can reassign it for other parameters. Like I can use it to control the volume or the panning, things like that. But the code that's coming from the MIDI Sprout device is pitch data, like pitch information. Yeah. Yes. Sure. Yeah, no, I always have been a plant lover, and just the campus around here too. I just like walking around in nature, and then Cage was a big influence. He was trying to like imitate nature in like his compositions. I'm like, when the MIDI Sprout came out, I was like, wow, I don't have to imitate it. I can actually use it directly for my pieces. And I don't know, I like the biological, like the kind of sort of like untamed quality. Like I don't know exactly what's changing these fluctuations in the data. I mean, I've done some kind of experiments with like grow lights and watering the plant and touching the plant. I mean, in some ways, like for like even what I'm doing tonight, like I like to have it's this data stream's coming to me even without me having to interact with a plant. It's still giving me data, and then I can use that and do this kind of like live mix. I guess that's sort of like my DJ background, like to play with faders and knobs. But yeah, it's like kind of like being a plant lover, and then this new device that's like lets me use it in the compositional way, and then figuring out like, okay, I need to limit this to have it work for me for my pieces, and then I've done like combinations too of like using multiple plants for the pieces. Like usually like at the Gardner, I usually have 3 MIDI Sprouts going, and some of those, one of them may even just control the parameters like the volume. And then the panning, and then I have the other ones actually creating the melodies and things. Yeah, yeah. You mean like my relationship with plants in general, or? Oh, do I cry for my plants? Right. Well, actually, no plants are harmed when I work. I have new electrodes that just caress. Yeah, sure. Yeah, actually, like, there were some plants that I wish worked at the Garden Museum that are, like, amazing, but those things, like, never give me any data. And there's, like, kind of a philodendron that's very finicky, and, like, I usually do, like, really long-form pieces that are, like, 4 or 5 hours. And the philodendron that's there always, like the last hour, it will give me some readings. I don't know if it has to like, there's like Scooby's back. But it's like I don't know if it's like if it has to warm up to me or yeah, But I mean, like I said, there's like a lot of people that are fans of the MIDI Sprout device. Like you guys can actually go and you can order one and you can connect it to whatever you want. But there are people that definitely are deep into like plant consciousness and like this sort of sentience that they believe plants. But I mean, I feel like there are a lot of things that plants like they perceive a lot more. They're more sensitive to light spectrum than we are. And there are a lot of things like they definitely can they can kind of smell humans, like the chemical differences, and so I feel like those things affect the data, But I don't know. It's kind of interesting to be able to maybe use some of those like outside, like using temperature or light control to maybe as a compositional means. Like I haven't pursued that that avenue yet. But I mean, they're still giving me enough data now to like to work with. Yeah, yeah, not right now. I mean, there's a YouTube of somebody like, like what does like cannabis sound like? And so there's a video of somebody like hooking up to, like a pot plant and like, but it didn't sound like stoned or it's just like, I mean, it definitely has its own specific, data stream. Like the plant that I've gotten the best sounds out of, or the most like, at least for me, was like this like a rosemary plant I bought at Trader Joe's, and I was doing a performance at like a restaurant that was started by an MIT grad in Cambridge, and so I was like, oh, let me get some like culinary plants, and so I got rosemary, and I think I've got like thyme, and so but I was playing around with the rosemary, and it was like playing in like equal measures, like almost like it was I had some percussion sounds set up and a few like tonal synths, but it was playing in like equal time for I think the whole time I had it connected. So I don't know what caused that. And I've used other rosemary plants, and they do kind of have like an evenness or like an equal kind of like almost like a timing. So I mean I guess I've done some like loose experiments just through different performance places, like, oh, I'll get rosemary for this place, and then I'll use what's at the gardener. So I kind of have a little bit like a log of like, oh, this plant works well, this plant does this. So yeah. Yes. Yeah, actually, I've connected to myself. It's almost like human skin is too conductive, so it's like almost too much voltage being like read, and so you get like a really really full like data stream. But you can dial it back. Like you can recode the device, and then from the computer end you can do the same thing. Like you can limit what it's reading. Like on my laptop that I use. That has a lot of the virtual instruments, I can transpose the data as it comes in, so I can create like interesting harmonies, and I can set it up so even if it's reading like giving me like 2 octaves worth of music, I can just tell it to play like 1 octave, or maybe even just play 1 note. Yeah, so we actually were playing around today, Carla and I, with like just a pile of leaves, and they're like, I think they were pretty fresh, right? I mean, they still had color, so they were conducting, giving us like a resistance measurement, and so we could arrange them, and we actually made a trail of them, and it was able to generate a signal from just like by making a path, almost like a circuit out of the leaves. So there's a lot more exploring to be done, and I feel like there's a lot more possibility. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, you mean like kind of like the field recordings? No, I've never combined that with the MIDI Sprout recording, but that's a good idea. Yeah. Oh, there's someone back there. Yes. Have I, or you want me? You're asking me. Sorry. Yeah, I mean, like the work I've done, like when I was in Iceland, kind of in nature. I mean, I would actually like to do more of that, more like with an environmental kind of like scope versus like taking like a plant that I got at the store, or like even the plants in the gardener courtyard, because I feel like maybe even then it's like the scope of it is even bigger. Like I like maybe like more implication, like that if it's out in the wild, I feel like maybe like there's larger factors contributing, which is like for me is an interesting notion that maybe there's something like with climate change, like what if I had this like 10, 20 years ago, like what would that data be? So I hope that answered it, your question. Is that it? So yeah, we're gonna go over to Forum Gallery.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I'll set up, and then we'll have a demo and a performance.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to step back up here and encourage everyone to follow us over to the new studios building. And just outside the Forum Gallery, Scooby will be doing a performance. We'll have some of the MIDI Sprouts on hand. We can talk about some of it. And we'd love to hear from you, because we're also a part of this trip is a research trip for me and Scooby working together. And we plan on engaging the entire campus and bringing interactive experiences to visitors who'll come here in the spring as the plants are just coming back to life. So please join us. There's also the International Student Show, I think, in the Forum Gallery. So there's, I think it should be a really interesting experience over there. And thank you.